Hello, everyone, and welcome into the 27th episode of Jack's Mailbag, the series where I answer your Gamecock athletics questions. If you have a question you want to ask me on next week's episode, be sure to drop a comment in the comments section below on this YouTube video, or I'll have a post on the Insiders Forum on GamecockCentral.com where you can ask any and all of your questions that you do have for me. This week, we are going to obviously be talking about the penalties that happened in the South Carolina and LSU game over the weekend and the impact that they had. And we'll also talk a little bit about Gamecock football as we look ahead to Akron this weekend. So without further ado, let's get into our first question from Bill Bryce, who asks the most obvious one. What do you think was the worst call of the game on Saturday? So there are a lot of different calls that had an impact on the final outcome on Saturday. And just for reference, this is going to probably be the final time I talk about the penalties. I'm ready to move on to Akron, and I think a lot of us that have been looking at the penalties over the last few days. I think it's not really doing much good for us to continue to dwell on it. We just got to move on and look ahead to what comes next. So I think the biggest, it's hard to narrow it down, but if I had to pick one, I think the biggest penalty of the game. There's two different ways of answering this. The worst penalty of the game, in my opinion, was the offensive pass interference call on Mazeo Bennett. I think without a doubt, that one I don't understand that one. And I actually asked Mazeo about it earlier today when he met with the media during his press conference. Here's the quote. He said, quote, "To be honest, I was just running my route. I had a rail route running full speed. I turned around and there was a flag called and they called my number. I didn't really know what it was, but got to deal with it, live to fight another day." So in case you missed the game or anything, there was a penalty call on Mazeo on 2nd and 8, midway through the fourth quarter. South Carolina had just gotten a stop on LSU, and this was right before I think they had maybe a 4-point lead midway through the fourth quarter, and Robbie Ashfords, who was in at quarterback at this point, threw a deep pass to Dale Von Campbell. It was caught at the LSU 32-yard line for a 43-yard gain. But unfortunately, there was a penalty that wiped it off, and it was pass interference on Mazeo. And look, I think a lot of people have talked about that play and thought that one was strange. And honestly, I don't understand that call either because, I'm watching back and I'm like, I don't see a penalty on that. But again, it's just one of those things where there were a lot of calls on Saturday that were definitely wrong, in my opinion. And let me just put that out there. Some of the calls are warranted, I guess, like false starts and illegal men downfield and offsides. That's stuff that South Carolina can control. However, the penalties and calls that they can't really control, and it's more so up to the officials' discretion. That's where I kind of get lost a little bit on some of these calls. And a lot of you guys are going to feel differently about specific calls, and not everyone's going to agree on it, and that's okay. That's kind of what sports is about. However, I think we can all kind of agree that this one on Mazeo was a little bit strange, and I just don't see why it was called. As for the biggest call of the game in terms of penalties, I think without a doubt, and whether it was the right or wrong call, I've kind of just gone back and forth on it over the last few days. The Kyle Canard, he had 3 penalties in the game, but I think the biggest one was definitely the second pick 6 where Nicky Minwari picked off Garrett Nussmeier in the end zone. And then Nick is running the ball back the other way, 100 yards. And you see Nussmeier in the background kind of starting to try to run towards the play. And honestly, I'm looking at it, I don't think he would have made a play on it because it's Nicky Minwari we're talking about. He's pretty fast. But either way, Canard knocked down Nussmeier while trying to run and push him down with 2 hands. Kyle puts up his hands, basically, insinuating that, he didn't do anything wrong. But unfortunately, the refs didn't see that way, and they called unnecessary roughness, and it brought what would have been, I think South Carolina would have been leading because they were up by 4. They would have been up by, I think, 11 after the PAT. It was a big play in the game because it's later in the fourth quarter, and it was a big momentum shifter because obviously later on, LSU, still only trailing by 4, went down and scored. But again, I think the big thing that we could take away in my final talk on the penalties here is that it's obviously frustrating, right? I can only imagine how frustrating it is for the fans, the coaches, and players to just see that you're called for 13 penalties. But at the same time, like I said before, a lot of the penalties that were called on South Carolina, they had complete control over, right? The refs didn't force Carolina to jump off sides or have a false start or have an offensive lineman downfield. It's just unfortunate that it happened, and especially unfortunate with some of the bigger calls like the pass interferences and Canard getting flagged 3 times. Like, I feel awful for him. It really stinks. But he did talk to the media earlier today, and I got to give him a lot of credit because it takes a lot of guts to just go out here and listen to everything that has been said and all that, and then he's got to answer questions from the media. And obviously, he was asked a few times about the penalties, but he answered them the right way, and he's ready to move on to Akron. I think a lot of us, should feel that same way, and I can definitely get behind what Kyle had to say there. So that's really it for all the penalty talk that I have. Again, it impacted the game in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it's like South Carolina did a lot of things to where they could have won that game in spite of the penalties. Like, they were up 17-0. They had a big lead, had a chance to really slam the door on LSU, but just never could. And then you really struggled on third downs, and you missed some tackles. Like, there's just a lot of things that happened in that game, despite, I think, how well Carolina played most of the way. I mean, they were winning majority of that game. I think the penalties were just one facet of why the Gamecocks lost. But it's definitely not like the only reason, in my opinion. So again, that's all I have to say on the penalties. And now we're going to shift the conversation a little bit to what else has been going on with Gamecock football. And the next question comes from SOB2USC, who asks, would you have put Luke Doty in for a series or two when we bogged down in the second half? So again, if you did not watch the game, Lenore Sellers went down with an ankle sprain right before the end of the first half. He got sacked on a play, and he kind of went down awkwardly by the way the LSU defender tackled him, and he ended up not playing the rest of that first half because there was only one play left. And then in the second half, he only played one series, and Robbie Ashfords saw the majority of the snaps after that. And look, Robbie's performance was a mixed bag, honestly. Obviously, it's not Lenore Sellers level. Robbie did some good things. He made some nice moves on the ground running the ball. He, got South Carolina in a position to score a touchdown with the Rocket Sanders run. And I know that's all on Rocket, but still, Robbie was, in a quarterback during that play. And then, just later in the game, he made some nice pass plays. But unfortunately, some of them got called back, obviously. And just the clock management wasn't particularly great either. And then Robbie took some sacks and that maybe he shouldn't have and fumbled twice. So there's a lot of things that were good and bad about Robbie's performance. And I could see why people would want to see maybe a different quarterback in there because maybe they just don't feel confident about Robbie at quarterback if in the event Lenoris isn't able to play. Now, I will say, from what we heard Shane Beamer talk about on Tuesday during his press conference, Sellers has been telling Shane that he's fine. He'll be ready to go for Saturday. And you look at the depth chart, I mean, Lenoris is the QB1 right now. So until further notice, that is going to be the case. And in the meantime, Robbie and Davis Bevel will be, still competing. And if in the event something happens, one of them would probably be the next man up, according to Beamer. So, but the question is in reference to Luke Doty. And what I'll say on this is, look, Luke is listed as a wide receiver right now, and he really hasn't been playing much at all this year. A little bit on special teams, but that's really it, to be honest. And I'm like looking back at his numbers. I mean, he had some pass attempts last year. I mean, I honestly forgot that he had 4 pass attempts for 17 yards against Furman last year, back in 2023. But the last time he legitimately played quarterback for the Gamecocks, you'd have to go back to 2022, and he had 10 passes for 146 yards, 10 completions for 146 yards. And he threw for 2 touchdowns with 2 picks. And honestly, I mean, it wasn't even a big sample size. I mean, honestly, the last time he was a legit starter at quarterback in the SEC, you'd have to go back to 2021. So I know the question is in reference to would you have put him in for a series or two? I'm going to say no, because we just don't know how much he's actually working at quarterback during practice. Like, I don't really remember ever really seeing him, throwing the ball around with the other quarterbacks when we were at open practices back in fall camp. And look, I mean, he's listed as a wide receiver, and it's not like I just don't think South Carolina would put him in that position because he hasn't played quarterback in legitimately in so long. And you have other options. I mean, you put Davis Bevel on scholarship recently. You're probably going with Robbie Ashford first, and yet you have Dante Reno also as another option too. So it's like I think I get the idea of putting Doty in, but for me, I know the team probably wouldn't do it either, but I just don't see why potentially that might be the case. I kind of disagree with putting him in a quarterback. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but I don't see that happening anytime this year. So that is going to do it for this week's episode of Jack's Mailbag. I know there was only 2 questions, but again, it's kind of been one of those weeks where South Carolina's coming off a loss, and it's not fun to talk about a loss. So hopefully that will change this weekend when the Gamecocks do take on the Akron Zips at 7:30 under the lights on ESPNU on Saturday at Williams-Brice Stadium. I will be there along with some of my coworkers. So be sure to stay locked into GamecockCentral.com for all live updates and coverage throughout this week. If you're not already, go ahead and subscribe and like this YouTube video, as well as, like I said before, just subscribe to our YouTube channel because we are doing a lot of good work on here. And we're doing a lot of good work on GamecockCentral.com as well. So that is going to do it for this week's episode. Hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.